Well, now let's take a closer look at American Indian culture. And before we do that, it is important to note how varied that culture is. Right now, there are approximately 500 tribes and bands still in existence in the United States. Now, centuries ago, before the Europeans arrived, there were many more. Quite a few have died out or become sort of intermingled with other tribes. So we're talking about hundreds of different types of people just in the United States. That's not counting Canada and down into Central America. And each of those tribes, each of those nations had their own unique culture. Usually they spoke their own language that other people didn't speak, although some of them were kind of related in their language, like, I mentioned earlier Athabascan language groups. It's kind of like Spanish, Italian, and French all come from Latin, and those people in those countries have certain things in common, but they're also very distinct and different from one another and have their own unique culture. So you got to be careful not to paint with a broad brush and say, what's the Indian word for such and such? Because, there's hundreds and hundreds of different words for whatever it might be because there are different languages. But that being said, there are certain regions of North America that you can kind of divide people into, in that the people in those regions have a lot in common with one another, such as the Great Plains, the Southwest, the Northeast and the Southeast, which are both considered Eastern woodland, but the cultures differed quite a bit from north to south. So what we're going to do now is we are going to take a look, a little bit of a tour through some of those cultural regions, not all of them, but just some, so you'll get an idea of what we're talking about and get an idea of the people that we're going to be dealing with in the early weeks of these lectures. All right, well, let's start with the desert Southwest, where you have Puebloan peoples such as the Hopi and the Zuni, and Athabascan peoples such as the Apaches and Navajos, and there are many different bands of Apache. They all speak roughly the same language but different dialects of it, and that's kind of like, if you've got people from, say, the American South and a New Yorker, someone from Australia and someone from Scotland, they all speak English, and they can understand one another, but there are some differences, right? So if you look at this example, this is the type of clothing traditionally that people in that region would wear. And that's because that's the type of clothing that you would wear if you're in the desert. So if you see old movies or TV shows and you've got a Native American character who's supposed to be Apache or Navajo, and they have them in a long, flowing, feathered headdress, that is inaccurate. In the Southwest, there was a place in what is now Mesa Verde State Park, and here's a picture of what I'm talking about there at the park. It's in the place that's today known as the Four Corners. It's where the states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico all meet. And there, in that area, there is a city that was carved into the side of a mountain. And just to give you a little bit of scale, if you look at that little ring that is there in the little city, those are people. That's about 30 or 40 people standing in a circle. So it gives you an idea of just how big this city was. And it was abandoned long before the Spanish arrived in the area. And when the Spanish came into the area and they met with the Puebloan peoples who lived, at the foot of that mountain, those peoples told them that this abandoned city was the city of the Anasazi, which meant the lost ones. So if you can just imagine this big giant ghost town in the side of a mountain carved into the rock, if you could imagine what it would sound like when the wind would blow through it. It made kind of a high-pitched whistling noise that from a distance kind of sounded like ghosts, like the wailing of lost spirits. In reality, probably what had happened is that the people who lived there had built this city in the side of a mountain because it was very easily defended. It would be hard for enemies to attack them. And at some point, probably in the 12th or 13th century, because we know there was a huge drought in North America for almost 100 years, that due to the drought, this area, they weren't able to get to the resources that they needed. Those resources dried up, and they probably, out of necessity, moved down out of the mountain and down onto the valley floor below, and probably became the ancestors of some of those people that the Spanish later met. Pretty impressive architecture, you have to admit. Also, let's look at the Pacific Northwest, also called the Northwest Coastal Region. And there you have tribal groups such as the Tlingit, the Chinook, and the Salish. And much like the desert Southwest people, Pacific Northwest or Northwest coastal tribes had a lot of cultural things in common, including their very distinctive and unique art style. If you look closely at the blanket this guy is wearing, you might be able to picture if you're a sports fan, the logo of the Seattle Seahawks. And that's not an accident. That logo comes from a traditional mask that's located in a museum in Seattle. These cultures, these tribes were very, very hierarchical. They were pretty complex. They did a lot of fishing. They did a lot of deep sea fishing. They had these really long canoes that they would travel pretty far out to go and get part of their food source. Another thing that they had that you've probably seen before is what you see outside this house. That is a totem pole. Now remember I said that these cultures were very complex and had a hierarchy. So what that pole does is these different segments of it tell who the people are, who their tribe is, who their band is, who their clan is, what village they live in, what particular family from that village they're from. So someone visiting from another village or even another tribe in the region would be able to piece together your whole life story pretty much from looking at this totem pole. And oftentimes, if you see these poles, there will be a bird at the top. And that's because the raven or the crow was one of the most sacred creatures to various tribes in the Pacific Northwest. And you don't see those totem poles in other regions in North America. You do see them, I think, on some Pacific Island groups. But when I was a kid, you used to be able to buy these little bags of plastic cowboys and Indians. And the Indians would come with a teepee and a totem pole. And that's just an example of cultural inaccuracy creeping in from an early age, because no one who made teepees would have a totem pole, because those are two different regions. Anyway, moving along, let's take a look at the tribes of New England. That is the eastern woodland region. In New England, you had some of the more prominent tribes, all of whom we're going to be talking about pretty soon. The Wampanoag, the Narragansett, and the Pequot. There were other tribes too, like the Massachusetts tribe, Massachusetts plural. So they lived in these round, usually, shelters made out of brush and reeds, and sometimes, like clay. Had a lot of cultural similarities to the other regions east of the Mississippi. And so here is a painting of what an artist envisioned a village and a member of one of these tribes would look like and dress like, and this is from a museum. Most of the tribes in that area, including the three listed here, speak some form of the Algonquin language group. So a lot of their words were similar. The big difference being in that whole region, the Iroquois and other tribes, the Iroquois specifically, they spoke Iroquoian languages. In fact, the Iroquois and the other tribes who lived around the Great Lakes are kind of like a subset of the northeastern woodland Indians with a lot of cultural similarities. So you've got the Iroquois, who basically traditionally controlled roughly the area of present-day New York State, and other tribes like the Mohegan and the Huron, who mostly spoke different forms of Algonquin languages and who were often at war with the Iroquois. Now, I mentioned earlier when we brought the Iroquois up that their name for themselves was the Haudenosaunee, which means people of the long house. And that's because their council meeting buildings had this shape, this very oblong shape. Here is a list of the 5 tribes that originally made up the Iroquois Confederacy or the Iroquois League. You don't have to remember these. Just to give you an idea, again, if you traveled in New York State, you'll recognize these words as place names. Or maybe the first group, the Mohawk, you associate with a hairdo, because that is the hairdo that they had, the men, and that's why it became called that, though there were lots of other tribes who did their hair that way. A 6th tribe, the Tuscarora, joined in 1792. Sachems meant leaders, so 50 chiefs essentially that made up this grand council. All right, well, let's move now to the Great Plains, which is this basically almost middle third of the country, which stretches from north to south, from the southern part of Canada all the way into the northern part of Mexico, and all points in between. Many tribes associated with the Great Plains, including in the north the Shoshone, Lakota or Sioux, and Cheyenne, also the Arapaho. In the south, the Comanches and the Kiowa in western Oklahoma and Kansas and down into Texas. Now, a lot of these stereotypes people associate with Native Americans and assume are universal are actually attributes of Plains Indian culture, such as the feathered headdresses, the long flowing eagle feather headdresses I mentioned earlier, and the use of teepees and various other things. I teach an entire semester-long course just on these tribes in the Great Plains. I also teach one about specifically the history of the Cherokees, about 5 or 6 different American Indian Studies classes that I teach, upper division classes, if you're ever interested. All right, well, let us now move closer to home to the southeast. And as I said earlier, the tribes of the southeast are also referred to as Eastern Woodland, but there are some differences between them and the northern Eastern Woodland Indians. So in the southeast, you've got tribes such as the more prominent tribes, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Creek Indians, whose name for themselves is Muskogee. When the first English settlers met the Muskogee, they met a group who was camped along a creek, and so they just started referring to them as those Creek Indians. and that kind of stuck. Like I said, their name for themselves, or autonym, is Muskogee, but they go by Creek as well. You'll notice here on the map it's kind of fuzzy. You may not be able to see real clearly, but there's a lot of different other groups. Seminoles down there in southern Florida. We'll talk more about them for sure later on. There was no such thing as a Seminole tribe when Europeans first arrived. It sort of developed from the southernmost members of the Creek tribe, and we'll see how that happened later on. All right, well, that's kind of a quick tour. We didn't really look at the Great Basin or the Plateau Indians because those don't come into actually they won't come into our story in the first half of the survey, briefly maybe in the second half, but just to give you an idea. And now what I want to do is look at some cultural attributes. And when I say cultural attributes, I'm talking about things that are either universal or almost universal across the board through all these different regions and all these different tribes, despite the fact that each tribe, again, is unique and distinct. So to kind of explain what I mean, I'm going to go back to the European example again, just because that's something that most of you are more familiar with. So I mentioned Spanish, Italian, and French earlier, so far as language groups. Well, they speak similar languages, and certain things about their cultures are similar to one another, but French is not Spanish, and Spanish is not Italian. And then you've got German people in Europe, and people who speak Germanic languages, such as in Scandinavia, for example. They have more in common linguistically with one another than they do with people who speak Romance languages from the Latin. And because of the climate, because of the environment, they have other things that have more in common with one another. But all those people are European, and if you were to talk about European culture, you'd be including all of them. And there's just certain things that, despite all their differences, that people from those regions do still have culturally in common. And part of it is because they're so close together and have been so close together for such a long time. Part of it is because of the shared history that they have in which they've all interacted. Part of it is because of the religious situation, the development of Christianity, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation. All those things kind of go in together with a melange and make certain things that you could say are European attributes. And the same thing is true with American Indians. There are some things, some ways of looking at things that tribes from virtually all over North America kind of have in common with one another that they definitely did not have in common with Europeans, because it is very, very different. And we're going to begin that examination by looking closely at this map. This is a very famous map, by the way. And if you go to Washington, D.C., to the Museum of the American Indian, you can see the actual real map. It's drawn on a deer skin. They have it spread out under glass, obviously, because it's almost exactly 300 years old. Now, the map was drawn by a Catawba Indian. Catawbas lived in North and South Carolina, and it was commissioned by the royal governor in Charleston, South Carolina, who asked this Catawba man to draw him a map so that they, the English, would know more about the interior of what today we would call the American South, because the English were basically only along the coastline. Pretty far, pretty deep into Virginia, but then, North and South Carolina. This was around the time that Georgia was being established. They didn't know a lot about farther inland. So this Catawba man drew them a map. This is a specific map, but there are actually plenty of examples of maps drawn by Native Americans in that time period and a little bit later, and this is kind of how most of them looked. Okay, so here's his map of the American South, and you may be looking at that thinking, well, what the heck is this? It looks sort of like a model of a group of molecules or something. Well, not exactly. So here's what that represents. Now bear in mind, it was drawn on a deer skin, and it was meant to be spread out on the ground or on a table, and then everyone would be standing all around it looking at it. So, it's not one direction is top and one is bottom. But essentially what you have right here is there on the left. You see all those, looks like a bunch of blocks. That represents the English settlement of South Carolina. They're in Charleston. It's all blocks. Those are like houses. And then if you look in the lower left-hand corner, it looks kind of like a parachute or an umbrella. But that's because we're not looking at it right side up. It's actually, if you flip that over, you would see that it is a boat with sails. So that represents Charleston Harbor. And then, over on the right side, this other big square, that is Virginia. So, right off the bat, we've got this representation of European places, of colonial places, as squares, as boxes. And then all these circles in between them represent different tribes, different groups of American Indian people. And some of them are connected together and some of them are not. What this indicates is what tribes are there, which ones are allied with which other tribes, and which ones are not allied with other tribes and are therefore enemies of one another. That's what this map is. It is not a geographic, topographical map. It doesn't have boundaries because this Catawba man, like most American Indians at that time, unless they'd spent a whole lot of time with Europeans, didn't even conceive of boundaries. They didn't even conceive of imaginary lines that divide up people's territory and land that is owned by people. That's not what he's getting at. He figures you need to know who's out there. It doesn't have the rivers and the mountains and everything, in large part because it was just assumed if you travel around in there, you're going to see those things. You should know where they are after you've seen them. That's not the important thing. The important thing is understanding the social connections of the different groups. Now, if you will notice there on the right, and again, you would have to kind of flip this over and pretend like you were standing facing this map from the upper right. This is a woman in a dress, if you can see that. What does that represent? Well, if we were, in class in person, I would take guesses, but I can't really do that, so I'll just go ahead and tell you. That represents this Catawba man's home village, his mother village. If you look over on the left, and again, this is kind of sideways, and you have to kind of like give it a quarter turn, basically counterclockwise. But you will see that there is a little stick figure of a man, and those little lines, he's either shooting arrows or throwing spears at the stick figure of an animal, a four-legged creature of some kind. What does that represent? That represents the Catawba people's hunting grounds, which is not right where their village is, and that was usually the case. with native peoples, especially east of the Mississippi, you don't do all your hunting right where you live. You have to kind of travel a ways because the game gets exhausted right where you live. He gave this to the governor of Charleston, South Carolina colony. And I'm sure the governor was like, what the heck is this crap? This doesn't help me at all. Because that wasn't what he was looking for. That's not what we look for when we look at a map. But that's what Indians were looking for. They had a different concept of not only what was important, but how to navigate space. The next cultural difference we're going to look at is the concept of time. Now, in European culture, Western culture, which sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? That Western culture is the western part of the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere isn't considered Western culture. It's kind of weird, but that's just how it happened. Anyway, European culture has this concept of a timeline, right? In which different events are placed, in proportion to where they are to one another, and these events and this timeline stretch backward in time to infinity. There's really no beginning to a timeline. I mean, it's implied that there is no beginning. There's always something before where it starts, and it stretches forward to infinity. Same concept. So that the more time that passes between a past event, the more time that passes, the more distant, the more far away that event is. And especially the more distance there is between that past event and the distant future. Well, that's, I don't really need to explain that, right? You guys understand how that works. That's not how it works in native culture. What we have here is the door flap to a teepee from a member of the Crow Indian tribe, or Absaroka, who live in the northern plains. And this is something that people would decorate their teepees with by basically telling their life story on it. And you'll notice it's not in a straight line, it's a spiral. And you will see that spiral representing time all throughout both North and South America. It's not a straight line that keeps going backward and keeps going forward. Because it's a spiral. You might have the same number of events, and if you could flatten this out, then you would have probably the same size as if it were a European-style timeline of these events. And incidentally, each one of these pictures represents 1 year of this guy's life. But because it's a spiral, the distant future and the distant past are never very far away. Now think about that for a moment. It's just a representation, right? Whether you have the flat line, European style, or you have the spiral, neither of them is a real thing. It's just a symbol for a concept. But the way those symbols differ from one another demonstrate the way those cultures think differently from one another. You see, in native culture, and you may have heard this before, there's always a lot of thought given to future generations. And there's always a lot of thought given to past generations. Generally speaking, people don't just live in the present, but they have this sense of connection to what has come before and connection to what is coming in the future. And that is part of the reason that for the last 50, 60 years, since the modern environmental movement started, anytime you see an environmental protest, you see a disproportionately large number of Native American people there. And it's because of this sense of connection to the future as well as to the past. So this is one of the things I was alluding to when I said early on that some of the philosophies and cultural approaches of the native peoples whom the Europeans looked down on as uncivilized and inferior, some of their concepts are more complex than the European version of those concepts. So it can kind of blow your mind if you think about it. It's kind of hard to get a handle on. Now think about the fact that with the map that we looked at and now the calendar that we've looked at, essentially what we're saying is that once the Europeans encounter the Native Americans, they have completely different interpretations from one another of such basic things as space and time. If you can't agree on what space and time are, odds are there's going to be a lot of other stuff you're not on the same page with. And indeed, spoiler alert, but you already knew this, there's going to be a lot of cultural misunderstanding between these groups. And more of it's going to come from the side of the Europeans because they never really, most of them, they never really care to try to understand the native perspective, which is why a lot of these ideas may be new to you. You never saw this in elementary school because it's just assumed, right? These people were primitive and barbaric. But they really weren't.